It's called Sputnik.
We know. Sit down.
From day one, the Soviet Union conducted its space program in complete secrecy. Successful missions were made public after their completion. Failures were kept secret. It's why so much of what happened in the Soviet space program didn't come to light until after 1993. In contrast, the US decided to conduct its space program completely in the open, and in front of the world's media. Largely forgotten by history was the first manned Apollo mission, Apollo 7. On October 11, 1968, it took Schirra, Easel and Cunningham into Earth orbit for nearly 11 days. Despite some issues, the mission proved the flight worthiness of both the command and service modules. The follow-up mission to Apollo 7 was Apollo 8, originally intended to be a second test of the command and service module, as well as the lunar module in Earth orbit. This plan was changed in August of 1968 after US spy satellites saw something big sitting on a Soviet launch site. The sight of the Soviet N-1 moon rocket sitting on its launch pad left US authorities convinced that the Soviets were about to launch a manned mission to the moon, a mission that may also have included a manned lunar landing. Despite the extreme risk involved, it was decided to send Apollo 8, without a lunar module, to orbit the moon. If nothing else, the US could claim to have symbolically reached the moon first, even if the Soviets landed before the US. The crew of Apollo 8 were the first humans to pass through the Van Allen radiation belts, receiving 1 mg of radiation, or about the same as a single chest X-ray. Apollo 8 reached the moon on December 24, 1968, and orbited the moon 10 times, before returning to Earth, and splashing down on December 27, 1968. The mission of Apollo 9 now became the original Apollo 8 mission. The testing of the lunar module in Earth orbit. Gumdrop and Spider were docked, then undocked, then flown apart, then together, and the descent stage dropped. Next came Apollo 10, a complete rehearsal of the Apollo 11 mission, which included everything, except an actual landing. Then on July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Edwin E. Aldrin Jr., flying the lunar module Eagle, landed on the moon at 20 hours, 17 minutes, and 40 seconds, UTC.
They're pegged on horizontal velocity. 300 feet down, 3.5. 47 forward. Put up. Down 1.5 down. 70. Got the shadow out there. 50 down at 2.5. 19 forward. Altitude, velocity, light. 3.5 down, 220 feet. 13 forward. 11 forward, coming down nicely, 200 feet. 4.5 down, 5.5 down. 160 feet, 6.5 down, 5.5 down. 9 forward. Good. 120 feet. 100 feet, 3.5 down, 9 forward. 5%. 185. Okay, 75 feet. Guys looking good, down a half. 6 forward. 60 seconds. Lights on. 6. Down 2.5. Forward. Forward. That's 40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Great shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward, drifting to the right a little. 20, down a half. 30 seconds. Forward, just. Good. Okay. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. ACA at a detent. Nose control both auto, descent engine command override off. Engine arm off. Port 13 is in.
We copy you down, Eagle.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
At 2 hours, 56 minutes, and 15 seconds, 6.5 hours after landing, Armstrong stepped off Eagle's footpad and declared, "That's one small step for,
Okay, Neil, we can see you
man,
coming down
one
the ladder
giant
now.
leap for mankind."
Okay, I just checked getting back up to that first step. That isn't collapsed too far, but it's adequate to get back up.
Roger, we copy.
It's a pretty good little jump.
Buzz, this is Houston. F2, 1/160th second for shadow photography on the sequence camera.
Okay. I'm at the foot of the ladder. The LEM footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine. I'm going to step off the LEM now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Apollo 11's landing was followed by Apollo 12, Apollo 14, Apollo 15, Apollo 16, and Apollo 17. Apollo 13 did not land, despite 100 hours of video, despite 1,000s of photographs taken using film cameras, despite hours of 16mm film taken in lunar orbit, despite tracking data, despite radio communication, despite television broadcasts, despite the building of 13 Saturn V's, despite the successful launch of 12 Saturn V's, despite the building of all the additional hardware, despite 400,000 people in both private and public industry working on Apollo over a period of 10 years, despite all this evidence, there are a small group of people who believe it was all fake. So if the USA, conducting their space program in front of the world's media, fake the first moon landing, and keep it secret for 50 years, why didn't the Soviet Union, conducting their space program in total secrecy, fake the first moon landing before the Americans? Many moon hoax believers state that the Soviets knew that all the Apollo moon landings were faked, but that they kept their mouths shut for 50 years, because they were dependent on US wheat. It's a nice tale of international blackmail, and quite untrue. The first moon landing took place on July 20, 1969. The 1972 Soviet-American grain deal took place a full 3 years after Apollo 11. The USSR had all that time to blow the whistle on the USA, and announce to the world that Apollo was fake, and that the US had lied. The Soviet-American grain deal of 1972 became known as the Great Grain Robbery. The July 1972 purchase of 10 million tons of United States grain, mainly wheat and corn, by the Soviet Union at subsidized prices, which resulted in higher grain prices in the United States. Food prices around the world rose 50% in 1973. Just weeks after this grain deal was announced, the Earth-observing satellite Landsat 1 achieved orbit. This led to the U.S. government seeking more information about global agricultural output via infrared satellite intelligence. The Soviet-American grain deal of 1972 was a disaster for everyone concerned, except the Russians, trying to make it the reason why the Soviets, who knew that the U.S. Apollo program was fake, kept quiet because they needed U.S. wheat is far-fetched. The Soviet N-1 rocket was ready in 1968. It was first launched on February 21, 1969. Its final launch took place on November 23, 1972. All 4 launches failed. 2 weeks later, the 6th and final Apollo mission landed on the moon. The N-1 program was cancelled. The Soviets failed to reach the moon because of the failure of their N-1 moon rocket. With the Saturn V, the Americans went to the moon 9 times between December 1968 and December 1972. They landed 6 times. Had the US been unable to reach the moon for all the usual reasons given by the moon hoaxers, the Soviets would have also known it was impossible to do, because they would not have been able to go for the same reasons. So they would have known that the US was going to fake its landing. Given that, there was no reason why they wouldn't choose to upstage the US and fake their own moon landing. The reason they didn't was because they knew the US landings were real. Attempting to fake a landing before the US actually landed on the moon would have been political suicide for all those involved.